The food history stuff went into the book a bit. For example, they cook their latkes with schmaltz.
I just want to point out that schmaltz is chicken fat for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about here.
Oh, your listeners must know about schmaltz.
Well, I hope so, but I don't want to assume.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. The beloved classic All of a Kind Family now has a spin-off. Author Emily Jenkins and illustrator Paul Zielinski have created the coziest possible Hanukkah picture book based on the characters of Ella, Henny, Sarah, Charlotte, and Gertie. In the interview, you'll hear us talk about our favorite scenes from the novels, and I hope you'll share your own favorites by calling in or leaving a comment at bookoflifepodcast.com. In the meantime, grab a latke and get ready to enjoy All of a Kind Family Hanukkah. So, first of all, welcome, Emily and Paul, to the Book of Life. Can one of you give us a quick description of All of a Kind Family Hanukkah?
All of a Kind Family Hanukkah is a story inspired by Sidney Taylor's classic chapter books about a family of all girl children living on the Lower East Side in New York City in 1912. These are really wonderful chapter books, and they were some of the first stories for children about Jewish life that reached a Gentile audience as well as a Jewish one. I created a story using that big family of girls, focusing on making latkes for a Hanukkah celebration. And the story centers on the emotional journey of the littlest sister, Gertie, who really, like any child, wants to help so much in the preparation of this celebratory meal. But, of course, it involves knives and graters and spitting hot oil and all kinds of things that a 4-year-old is not allowed to touch. So it's really a very universal story about her frustration at not being able to be one of the big kids and the way that her father sensitively helps her out of her terrible mood by helping her to kindle the lights of Hanukkah.
Speaking as the illustrator, I can say that it's wonderfully written, and it was a real joy to illustrate.
You know, when I first read this picture book, I assumed that you were taking an actual incident from the original stories and just picture bookifying it, so to speak, because it felt so authentic, and it took a while for me to realize, and I actually had to go back and search through all of the Hanukkah episodes that happened within any of the novels to check and see if this had really happened in those stories, and then I was surprised to realize that this was original.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I made it up.
Yeah. When this idea was first being cooked up to do a picture book based on All of a Kind Family, was that idea considered to take an existing storyline and turn it into a picture book, or was it always going to be an original project?
It was always going to be original. I mean, they don't need me to cut a story down and make a picture book out of it. And it wouldn't have been a picture book. A picture book is a different art form. The rhythms, the page turns, the way you introduce characters, the focal point, the emotional life of the young child is generally the focus of the picture books that I write. It's just a different beastie. So it never occurred to me to take one of Taylor's stories. They're beautifully written as they are, but they're not picture books.
So this book is sort of like fan fiction, isn't it? Because you've
written additional adventures
for existing characters. Was this your own inspiration, or were you asked to do this?
We were asked to do it. We had done 4 books before, 3 of them chapter books in the Toys Go Out series, and one of them a picture book with those same characters. And because this is also a picture book based on a chapter book series, our editor, Ann Schwartz, thought to pair me and Paul together again. She knew I loved the Sidney Taylor series. She knew my kids had grown up with those books, and she invited me to write a picture book based on these characters.
And she was a big fan of them. So it was basically her idea to do this fan fiction project. And she approached Emily.
Emily, you mentioned your own relationship with the original All of a Kind family books, that you were a fan and your family was a fan. Paul, had you read the books before you tackled this project?
Yes and no. I didn't grow up with them, but my daughters did. I have 2 daughters, and they're both grown now, but they loved the All of a Kind family books, and they read them to themselves. But I hadn't read them until Anne mentioned this project. So at that point, I read the first book, and then the other ones, and I definitely see the appeal.
So for both of you, I'd like to ask, what's your favorite All of a Kind family adventure from the original books?
My favorite is the one where Henny, who is the rebel sister, borrows oldest sister Ella's white dress, wears it to a party, and spills brown tea all over it. And then she gets the clever idea to dye the entire dress tea-colored and sneaks it back into Ella's closet, pretending that nothing has happened because the dress is now all a uniform color. It's just a gentle, light tea color. And this is a fan favorite story. I mean, everybody brings up Henny and the tea dress whenever they talk about these stories. And I think it's because Henny is really a very compelling and naughty character, and she's kind of the character that you admire for all of her chutzpah.
And Paul, what's your favorite?
Again, Henny, when she stayed out too late with her friend and they tried to sneak back into the apartment, and the father starts to punish the friend because it's in the dark and they don't see who's getting it.
Yeah, he spanks Henny's friend by accident.
Yeah. I guess I really responded to that because I studied it so hard. It was one of the stories that gave you a clue to the layout of their apartment and where the doors were and where the different rooms were in relation to the doors and the kitchen and the hallway and the bedroom, because that was necessary for me as an illustrator to figure out.
It's a whole different way of looking at the stories, not for just what's happening in them, but for the clues as to the physical environment. We'll talk about that in a minute because that's really interesting. I just wanted to tell you that my favorite scene from the books is when Charlotte and Gertie buy the candy and cookies and crackers and go to bed and have a whole game made out of eating all of these treats in secret.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, so did you recognize that little callback in All of a Kind Family Hanukkah?
Yes, with the
Has Ginger
cookie
snaps under her
the
pillow, right. I absolutely did. That was like a great fan moment to sneak that in so that fans will recognize it and other people will just think it's a cute detail without realizing that it's a callback. So it works either way.
Yeah, I had a really fun time with those.
Were there any others like that you want to mention that we should be looking for as we read the book?
Smaller ones. The song that Ella sings, Rock of Ages, is a song that she sings in the novels. And, there's one more.
The library book?
Just now I'm
referring to a library
book? Library book. Right, of course, the library book. And, of course, the library books start the All of a Kind family series. The very first story is about a lost library book. And there are repeated stories of the girls going to the library as a weekly ritual. It's really a center point of their lives.
Excellent. Let's go back to talking about the layout of the apartment. Paul, can you talk a little bit more about how you researched the physical environment for the story?
Well, for many of the pictures, it really didn't matter, and there wasn't much visible in the background. But to some degree, it was just the standard tenement apartment. And I have a friend who does a lot of renovation of apartments, and I went to him and asked him, what do you think about this? Is there a fireplace on the wall? Where does the stove sit on the wall? And how about the windows and what could go where? Things like that. But then in my planning of the book, it changed at one point, and suddenly I had to have a cutaway of the entire apartment, or as much of it as it would fit on the page. And suddenly I had to know where the doors were and where the hallway was and everything. Could have just winged it. I could have made something up. But I felt I was already taking a lot of liberties from the original books because I decided not to be slavishly or even slightly dependent on their illustrations. I wasn't convinced that their illustrations were that authentic But I really thought that if there were things in any of the books describing the house, I just decided I wanted to be true to all of them as much as I could. I also thought this was almost certainly a true description of the real house that the real family lived in. So I started to wonder whether it exists and whether I could find it if it's still there. So that was its own little odyssey that I know is kind of crazy, unnecessary, but it was fun. And I live in Brooklyn Heights. It's not that far from the Lower East Side. It's right across the bridge. And I managed to do some research with the help of a bunch of people, really, largely a cousin who does genealogy. And I found the address where the real books took place. But that address now has a dentist's office in it. And I kept planning to go there and see if I could get in, and I just didn't have time and didn't do it. And finally, I went there after I was done with the book, because there were some really puzzling questions I had. They weren't questions about Emily's book. They were questions about the chapter book. So it had no earthly relevance to my own work, but I was just too curious. Questions about how they could build the sukkah in the backyard when the apartment was on the second floor. Various other things, how they got in and out through the back window. I went to this house and figured that since it was a dentist's office, they would be open and I could get at least into the hallway. The upshot of this so far, as we speak, is that it was not open, and it's a dentist's office that's open only 2 days a week, which I don't understand how that could be. But sometime, very soon, I'm going to go there one of those 2 days and hope they let me into the backyard, into the hallway, and upstairs and whatever.
That's awesome.
And it is the building, it is definitely the building where the Olive Kind family lived, because I spoke with Jo Taylor Marshall, who is Sidney Taylor's daughter, and she said, yep, that was it.
Excellent. And I just want to make sure that our listeners know that the Olive Kind family books are autobiographical. They're fiction, but they're based on Sidney Taylor's own family memories that she wrote up for her daughter, Jo. So just to make sure people realize that. So that's wonderful that you found the actual address and that you've been to the site. So when you find out how they were able to climb in the back windows and the answers to all of these questions, please do share that information. I'm sure everybody listening would like to know.
I'm not sure everybody would, but I know I would. So absolutely, I'll let you know.
Okay. So you obviously went to great lengths to make sure that the illustrations were authentic to the original books and to the historical setting. So Emily, on the writing side, how did you make sure that your story was authentic to the setting and to the original stories?
Well,
Did
I
you have
knew
to do
the
any
stories
research?
very well. So in that sense, it was not hard to connect in a genuine way with the characters. They were well known to me. They felt like hanging out with old friends. But I did have to do food history research. I called a number of different food historians. I had a rabbi who consulted with me on the back matter, where I tell the story of Hanukkah. I also talked to a bunch of historians who work on the history of the Lower East Side and the immigrations that happened, all of which is really for the back matter, which is short and sweet, but I wanted it to be accurate. I didn't want to erase any of the different populations that were living there at the time just by, trying to make short sentences. I wanted everything to be as accurate as I could in that small space. The food history stuff went into the book a bit. For example, they cook their latkes with schmaltz, which nowadays people use olive oil, and in the middle of the century, people were using Crisco, but in 1912, they would have been cooking in schmaltz. And so that affected, of course, what they would serve alongside their latkes. They only served applesauce, no sour cream, eating roast chicken alongside it as well. Since they were already eating schmaltz, I figured they could have some chicken. So, crafting the meal that they're preparing together, also finding out, for example, whether the tradition that my family does every year, which is to put our menorah in the window for all the neighbors to see, and which so many families in New York City do. I didn't know if they were doing that in the Lower East Side, and it was an image that I really wanted and which Paul really masterfully used throughout the pictures. But I needed to make sure that that was something that people were doing in 1912 the way that we do it today, and it turned out they were, but of course that took a lot of phone calls to corroborate.
Okay. I just want to point out that schmaltz is chicken fat for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about here.
Oh, your listeners must know about schmaltz.
Well, I hope so, but I don't want to assume.
Why do you think the All of a Kind family books are a good choice for extending with this kind of fan fiction, as we're calling it?
Fan fiction is sort of a funny word. It makes me think that this is like high fantasy or a different kind of book. But in order to draw that kind of reaction, I think all you really need is an original that a lot of people feel very powerfully about. I think that's true of this, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, the love that people have for All of a Kind family, people who grew up with the series, is really passionate. I was out to dinner with some girlfriends last night, and one of them brought up the book because she had seen it, and all the rest of them went crazy. My friend who grew up in Jamaica had read these books and loved them. She'd only had the first two, I think, and she read them over and over.
You mean Jamaica, the island, not Jamaica, the part
not
of
Jamaica,
neighborhood in Queens, right?
The island of Jamaica.
Wow.
And it was her first exposure to Jewish culture and Jewish family life, and she just loved these books, not just because of that, but also, of course, because of the wonderful characters and the warm family situations. They're very comforting, very warm, very joyous books. They don't skimp on looking at the fact that this is the family living in a moderate degree of poverty. They don't skimp from talking about what's going on in the world at the time, but the central emotion that you come away with is one of connection and ritual and faith and togetherness.
That's a great description. How did the weight of carrying on Sydney Taylor's legacy impact your creative process? Was it scary at all to be meddling with something that, as you say, people have this great love for?
I didn't feel scared so much as excited. I felt like I had an invitation to this wonderful party, and I knew that I was lucky to have it. I knew that because I loved the books and had read them so many times, that I would be true to Sydney Taylor's characters rather than doing some kind of ironic take or clever angle on them. I felt confident that I could be truthful and respectful.
I think that if I had actually grown up with these books, I might have felt some of that hesitancy to meddle. But I also went through an experience a long time ago of illustrating a book called The Random House Book of Humor for Children, which took a huge chunk of children's literature and had me re-illustrate everything. So I was re-illustrating Homer Price, like you name it, and I had to re-illustrate it. So I've been inured to that a little bit. I just was trying to make this book what I could make it into.
Well, also, Paul won the Caldecott for Rapunzel and has done many fairy tales, and he is, I think, really fearless about reimagining stories that have been illustrated in ways that people are attached to. He has this amazing ability to capture what people care about in a story and still make it look different than they've ever seen it look before.
That's just because they haven't seen it correctly done before. That's what you do.
You do it right.
I love it.
Okay, great. Those are good answers. So you both made it as authentic as you could, but at the same time, you made it your own. So let's talk about that. Emily, why did you choose to focus on Gertie and her frustration with being too young to help cook the latkes? And did you consider any other storylines before you settled on this one?
I never considered any other storyline, and I think that's partly because I love to write about food, and I throw a big latke party most years, and in any case, I always cook a lot of latkes. And so I felt that, so much of what Sydney Taylor does is to represent rituals of food and faith and family, and I felt that food and family were where I was strongest, and I really wanted to convey the family cooking together. I also very often write about children who lose their tempers. I do love a good tantrum and that feeling of being out of control about your feelings and then coming back to a safe place. It's a narrative that I write often, and I think I engaged in it a lot as a child. And so it was also natural for me to have an emotional crisis in the middle of this big, warm family story.
All right. And Paul, I want to talk about your art style in this book. The art is very different from pretty much every other book you've ever illustrated, I think. You're very well known for the delicate detail, as in Rapunzel, or The Toys Go Out is also sort of more delicate. And sometimes you do lighthearted cartoon style, like in Z is for Moose. But this is something else. So can you talk about how you came to this style?
I'm not totally sure I understand how I came to it, except by elimination. I was assuming at first that it ought to be in a style that looked like the 1910s, which was fairly delicate, really, and careful with a lot of ornament and design in it. That's what the real Olive Kind family probably would have liked to hang on their walls and in their calendars on the kitchen wall and in the books that Gertie would get out of the library. Even it didn't even appeal to me to do that, but I thought that's how it ought to be done. But there was a lot of stirring of new art ideas at that time too. So I thought about that, and I mentioned it to Ann Schwartz, to the editor. I said something about a rendered look, meaning kind of carefully shaded and real looking. And she said, well, that's the last thing I want to see. So that was sort of a license for something else to come out. And then when I was making sketches, really all I can say is this came out. And then I figure out maybe a reason for it. And the reason I wrote about it in my little afterword in the book. Basically, it's a lot like Expressionist art. Expressionism was just beginning right at that time. And that was an art that was all about strong feelings. The pictures are kind of rough. They have thick outlines around everything, put down with a lot of energy. So there's a feeling of emotional energy and just physical energy and texture and stuff, physical stuff, when you look at the page. Even though I have to say I did it all in Photoshop, so there wasn't any physical anything in it. But that doesn't matter because if it looks like it is.
Yeah, I assumed it was paint.
Thank you. I think it looks to me like paint.
I wanted to ask you about a particular scene. I noticed when Gertie has a tantrum because she's not allowed to help, everyone looks perturbed except for Henny, and Henny looks kind of sympathetic. So can you talk about that choice in your illustration?
Yeah, I think everybody has a different way of looking concerned and alarmed and shocked by Gertie. But yes, Henny is the mischievous one. So I didn't think that she would be so shocked by Gertie misbehaving. I think she would be rooting for her a little bit, don't you?
I agree. I think that's a great characterization to just subtly have her with a different expression than everyone else. Emily, how did you imagine the characters before they were illustrated? And did Paul's illustrations surprise you when you first saw them?
They did surprise me, just because I had spent so many years seeing these characters illustrated as they are in the published books. Although the published books have different illustrators from one another, they still characterize the girls in basically similar ways. So I could easily recognize all of the girls because they were themselves. But the style surprised me. This was the fifth book that I've done with Paul. But, I've looked at all of his work and admired it. And one thing I always say to students when I visit schools and lecture is I show a slide of Paul in the middle, and then I show 4 different books that he's illustrated all around him, and I point out that every book looks different and every book has a different style. So really the only thing you can count on Paul for is awesomeness and surprise. He tries something new with most of the books that he illustrates. Even with the 4th book that we did together, which was the same characters, he did that book in full color, and he did it digitally, whereas when he'd done color with these characters before, he had done them in pastel. So it was a new way of imagining these characters that still made them completely recognizable. So he just did it again with All of a Kind family. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I felt a sense of connection to the characters right away.
Yes, they do seem just like themselves. I agree. Will you both be creating other new adventures for the All of a Kind family?
We don't know yet.
I think that isn't known yet.
Yeah, we have
there,
to
we said the same
talk
thing.
about it with our editor and with each other. It was a joy to work on, so I would love to do more if there turns out to be an audience for them.
That's right. So huge numbers of people have to go out and buy All of a Kind Family Hanukkah in order to justify the publisher deciding to continue as a series.
Well, I hope they will. I had asked you both to take the BuzzFeed quiz called Which All of a Kind Family Sibling Are You? Before we got together. So you took the quiz?
I did. I love that quiz. It's so fun.
It really is. So which sibling were you, and do you think it fits?
I was Sarah, and it's not surprising at all because that is definitely the character with whom I identified as a child reader. It's also the character who represents the author, Sydney Taylor. She was the middle child of the 5 girls in her own family, and her birth name was Sarah. Sarah is the bookish child, the future writer. She's the dreamer, but she can also be quite worried about making mistakes or wrongdoing. She's maybe a little tighter wound than some of her sisters, and she suffers for it.
Okay, and so that fits in with your own feeling about your personality?
Yes, and certainly my personality as a child. Sarah is the character, aside from Gertie, that I used the most. She opens the book talking to Gertie and basically explaining the story of Hanukkah, both to 4-year-old Gertie and to readers who might not be familiar with it.
I have to say, I'm not a big fan of this sort of quiz thing. When I took it, I was aware of all the questions and what they had in mind, and I didn't see anything that really I could honestly say was true more than another thing. So I took it the way I felt like taking it, and the first one came out as Charlotte, but then I thought I'd take it again as somebody else, and I made myself come out as Henny. I think I also took it as Ella, and finally I decided let me be Charlie, and that was the last one. I was Charlie.
So you reverse engineered it.
Yep. Mm-hmm. But I didn't think I had a choice because there was no other way I could take it. I also knew already at that point that Emily had taken it and was Sarah, so I didn't want to step on her toes.
Very good. All right, that was fun. So, in what way does this book contribute to Tikkun Olam, or healing the world?
Oh, I think every good book does that. And I think this is a good book. I think Emily deserves the credit for making it a book that would foster understanding and love and feelings of warmth and togetherness. I don't know how much in the general culture you actually see Jewish families doing something like that. A lot of move toward diversity and inclusion of many different cultures, and I don't see why Judaism should not be one of them.
That's a lot to ask of a picture book. But I think that picture books generally contribute as gateways to literacy, as means of parent-child or caregiver and child connections, as family traditions. Stories get read and reread over the years. People very often remember stories that they connected with first as very young children. So I believe in picture books. This book in particular is about, losing your temper, recovering, being forgiven. I think it can act as something of a role model for parents and children to show recovery from a bad fuss and what that might look like in a loving family.
That makes good sense. Let's go a little further with the idea of Tikkun Olam. Beyond reading this book, is there an action that you want to invite us to take to help heal the world?
This doesn't have to do with All of a Kind Family, but I believe that we all need to be voting. We are not all voting. I spend a bunch of my volunteer energies working with Rock the Vote and trying to encourage young people to vote, but people of all ages need to vote. We just don't have the greatest voter turnout, and I think that we can make a huge difference in America and beyond by turning out, and that means encouraging your Nana to turn out. It means encouraging your friends and family to turn out. It means driving people to the polls. It means helping get people registered.
there are organizations, devoted to doing good things. I was thinking about the organization HIAS, H-I-A-S, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, which is very relevant to the Lower East Side Jewish story of Olive Kind family, was strong and did a lot of good work early in that century, but it continues and now does a lot of good things, educating immigrants and helping them all over the country, all over the world. So I would say that would be a good thing to support. I also am active with PEN America, organization that stands for freedom of speech around the world, and that's something that could use people's support.
Excellent. Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask you?
Well, I have said how much I enjoyed working on this book, and it was different. All the books I've done have been fiction, really by choice. I haven't been exactly drawn to nonfiction, but in a certain strange way, this book, with all the research that I decided I had to do for it, became like a nonfiction story, and I loved all of the things I had to do for it.
I hope that people will turn not only to my picture book that I made with Paul, but to Sidney Taylor's books, right? I mean, one of the reasons for this picture book is to reacquaint people who have kind of been long away from the Olive Kind family with the family, and to introduce new readers to these stories, which are really, really lovely pieces of kind of classic American children's fiction.
Emily Jenkins, Paul Zielinski, thanks so much for joining us, and happy Hanukkah.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and happy Hanukkah to you. And thank you, Emily, for the book, and thank you, everybody, for looking at the book.
Thank you for having me on the podcast. It was a pleasure. Happy Hanukkah to you.
Hi, this is Hilary Saxton, children's librarian at the Cambridge Public Library and host of the Stand-Up Storytime for Social Justice. I'll be joining you on the Book of Life podcast. I would like to dedicate this episode to public libraries because they provide a safe space to really feel at home and learn something new every day.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.